Welcome to Middle Fingers Up, the show where we hold our heads high and our middle fingers higher. I'm your host, Kieran McKay. Today's episode will be exploring the complexities behind navigating cultural divides in therapy, particularly for individuals from immigrant backgrounds adapting to Western societies. As a child of immigrants myself, I understand the challenges of balancing our cultural heritage, the norms and expectations of the Western world, especially when it comes to seeking therapy. There's often a gap between a therapist and many of us, and today we want to talk about how to address this gap. While we are addressing it in therapy, I believe this conversation is relevant for anyone, not just therapists, as many of us are engaged in relationships between both Eastern and Western cultures. Today's guest is no stranger to our podcast. In fact, this marks her fourth appearance, and we're incredibly grateful for her continued participation in our meaningful conversations here. Her expertise and insights have consistently enriched our discussions, and we're so thrilled to have her back once again to explore this important topic. So welcome to registered clinical social worker, Angela Hick. Hi. Thanks for being part of these ongoing conversations. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's a little snowy here in Calgary, but other than that, hopefully spring is around the corner.
I like Easter is. So yeah, hopefully the snow goes away. So fourth episode, just want to go back and make sure we, give you a chance to have your plug with all the episodes you've been on. So you were one of our very first guests. You were on in episode 5. I'm taking care of my son's mother, and we covered postpartum, how to connect with our kids, how to find ourselves again after having kids. We also had you on for episode 9, What Would Your Mother Think? And that one was about consent, parenting to prepare versus parenting to protect, internet, healthy sexual boundaries. That was a really, really big one, received a lot of feedback. And the last one you were on was in episode 41. Your biggest tool is curiosity. And we talked about back to school, but also in life, just transitions and how to prepare for them. And what do we do when we find ourselves struggling in the midst of them? So thank you for coming back, as we are, I don't know what episode this would be, probably in the 70s. So
wow.
Yeah.
Getting up there.
We're getting old. So that's a good sign, right? Every episode is a sign that conversations are happening and doors are opening. So that's all we can ask for.
It's so awesome that, what you've built here, I think is really incredible and meaningful for a lot of people.
Well, I appreciate that. I know it is for our household and some, feedback we get, and folks like you that keep coming back and guests that come on are a good compliment to the fact that this is a community-led initiative. And, I can't just be sitting here every day talking nonsense. Otherwise, I'll just talk about selling sunset all day. It's a collective. So the more angles we can look at things, the better we can be at growing. And sometimes they're tough angles. Sometimes it's hard learnings and growings, I know for me, and I'm sure for some of our listeners and guests too. So I'm grateful to being part of keeping this going. So okay, so let's roll into our MFU. Give me being organized today, hey?
Yeah, nice.
Okay, because we'll, usually we shoot the shit for 6 hours and then we record. So
yeah.
Trying to be more efficient. Okay, so MFU, did you bring one? What do you want to put your middle fingers up to?
Yeah. I would just say trying to teach a toddler how to sleep.
Oh.
That is just not really going that well for us. And we've actually reached out to an occupational therapist to give us ideas. And I kind of grappled with is this me being dramatic or an exaggeration? And so that's what I did. I asked the OT, is this appropriate? And she says, based on like what you've described, like, yeah, I can help you. So
nice.
So we're pretty lucky to have like the insurance to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And
Well,
hopefully I get to sleep soon.
well, yeah, like happy baby is happy family. So in
Yeah.
order to have a happy baby, you have to have a baby that sleeps. So I can appreciate the place that you would be in. I'm sure others that have been there too. It's like you can't function. Can I ask how I'm so curious how occupational therapists, like what would they do that could be helpful with sleep?
Well, I guess it's probably better that an occupational therapist answers that. But from my perspective, like I worked in a children's mental health setting where we used occupational therapy all the time. So I'm pretty familiar with those kind of interventions, but I'm not familiar with it for like a pediatric, like kind of toddler.
Okay.
So I was like nervous to try some of those things just because like he's so small and it's more an adolescent population. So things about like how to meet his sensory needs so that he's not sensory seeking when he's trying to go to sleep, try to kind of empty out that gas tank. He's pretty energetic. And just like how to structure the bedtime routine, as well as like recommendations about screen time, because that is issue that we have in our home that everybody is facing right now. Yeah.
Okay, so I just have to say, and I'm sorry that this is happening, but also thank you as a therapist for talking about it, because sometimes we look at professionals that are in your field to have the best, well-behaved, structured homes and kids. And I love that you're like, I'm human too, and I'm a mom. And our kid also has issues with electronics, because that is literally the world we live in. So it doesn't matter where we come from. We're experiencing this sort of new age world. And so I'm like really glad that you talk about that, because I would imagine so many parents, like the kids are getting younger and younger with electronics, which means the impact is different than with my 12-year-old, right? Then that's sort of where we started dealing with it at adolescence about all these things, and now we're starting younger. So yeah, what are you finding? What are tricks that you're learning with some of these structures you're trying to put in place?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I learned is like, I am not at my best at 3 a.m. Anyone who has encountered me at 3 a.m. can tell you I am not at my best, especially like he wakes up screaming. So like for my own sensory system, being woken up by someone that I love screaming is very jarring. Of course, I'm like kind of used to it, but I don't like it.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, is there a better way, a different way? Is there something I'm missing?
Right.
That's why I need an outside set of eyes.
Yeah.
And I have the humility to be like, I definitely don't have everything figured out. So,
well, I think that's important, right? Like, it's like even in our families, we do this. We have secrets, or we think we have to just know it all. I do this all the time, where my brain tricks me to think you should just know this. And then I won't ask for help, or I won't look outside of my household to ask a friend or someone else like, hey, how did you do this? Because I feel it's my ego, I'm sure, but I feel like I should just know this already. And so it's nice to talk to other people, because they remind you we are dealing with a lot of similar, say for parenting, there's a lot of similarities with that. Or if it's financially with what's happening with inflation and all that out there, there's a lot of similar things we're sharing that are on our minds. So the more we talk about it, I think actually ends up helping us. But some of us get stuck like me about, oh, no, I should just know. So how do you do that? How do you as a therapist, on one hand, people come to you for answers, and now on the other hand, as a mom, you're like going to someone else. Like, how did you get to that place of, no, I need this help, it doesn't matter?
I think part of it is like my specialty is not toddlers.
Yeah.
Is one. And like I have an awareness of child development, but I think part of it is there is utility in having an outside set of eyes to kind of, because I have blind spots. My husband has blind spots. We're working together as a team, trying to tackle this issue that's impacting even the dog.
Yeah.
Is impacted.
Yeah.
Right. So we're trying to figure this out. And I know that there's things happening that like I can't see because of my own bias. And that's why like I think all the great therapists I know have their own therapists. People who don't go to therapy, and like I would just be curious about that, because the work is too hard. So I think that absolutely you should get an outside perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, I wish you well, man. I don't know if you want to add to the MFU. Like, is there anything else you want to say to that?
I hope everyone just keeps me in their thoughts.
Yes.
At 3 a.m. if you wake up, you're like, oh, I hope Angie's doing okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No doubt. Hope she doesn't have a 9 a.m. client.
Yeah. I don't book those anymore.
Yeah, you learned. Your son's taught you.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you? What's your middle finger up?
Oh, I knew I had to have one today because you are always the guest that will be like, what about you? And I had to like think about this because I was like, why don't I have an MFU like literally before you signed on today? But maybe what I'll put my middle fingers up to is the perception of my logo. So middle fingers up to the perception of the middle fingers up that I have. This is, you know, I always say all talk is good talk, right? Like all press is good press. So like when I get feedback, I appreciate it. But that I'm also, you know, I also have an ego. I'm also human. So I'm also like, what do you mean? Because it's mostly about me wanting to impress everyone. And so I've come to conversations lately, or I've been rejected in some ways by, you know, certain platforms that want to partner up with me or are interviewing someone that I interviewed and want to share, you know, the podcast that they were on, but can't do it because of the stigma behind my middle fingers up. And it's not professional. So sometimes when I put my sweater on, even I'm like, oh, you know, like, or because I get looks, but no one is curious to say like, yo, lady, why you rocking that cool middle finger? It's offensive to me, you know, like that'd be cool. And I'd be like, oh, cool. Like, let's talk about that. I don't want to offend you, but right. Because the whole point of the logo is to just be blunt and in the face of stigma, because I don't know any other way that we can do it. Trickling around it, any kind of stigma there that we have in it, whether it's, you know, towards racism, whether it's towards mental health, addiction, divorce, having kids, not having kids, fertility, all the things we talk about. When we beat around it, pussyfoot around it, we're not actually dealing with it. We're just adding to it. And so I've lost a couple of opportunities that could have been cool because of that. And so somebody was just kindly asking, like, would you be interested in rebranding? And so I don't know, like I left that conversation. I don't know what my answer to that is. I haven't even really thought of would I or wouldn't I. I just left that as okay, I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But that's sort of what my middle fingers is going up to is, you know, what do I do with that? Do I rebrand? Do I keep the middle finger? Do I keep pushing through that? Do I come at it a different way? I don't know, right? Because there's so many different angles to come at it. So
yeah.
What would you do?
What would I do?
Yeah.
I would probably like ask the people who listen to the podcast what they think about it.
Okay, well, I won't ask you since you don't listen to it.
So. Oh, yes. No, I listen to it. I think,
I'm just bugging you.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I do think it is something that is in your face, but your whole thing is about challenging societal norms, colonial history, and I don't think there's like, is there a gentle way to do that? And it's like, that history is extremely aggressive. So
yeah,
I don't know. You don't always have to like meet aggression with aggression, but I'm kind of into it.
Oh, well, I'm only here to serve you. So I'm good to know that. Well, I like what you say, because I hear two things there. I hear, do what you feel you're going to do. Like I hear that, but I also hear you saying on one hand, that is what we're trying to do is challenge these stigmas and like, let's get to it. We waited long enough. Why are we not talking about it? It was pretty aggressive, some of these ways that we've built societal norms. And yet at the same time, yeah, definitely. I don't want the message to be that let's meet aggression with aggression, because when we know better, we can do better. And I think that helps us heal as well. But ... I guess to be continued. Maybe that's the question, is asking more listeners what they think. Would they recommend this podcast more? Would they rock a sweater? Would they, you know, support it in a different way if it wasn't the middle finger? It was something else. Let's see what, you know, it is a community-led initiative. So let's see what our community is saying when we put that out there. That's the call to action. Look at us. We're already getting the call to action done here. Hey.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, I'm going to, you mentioned in your MFU blind spots, and you made an interesting point. You said something about how you and your husband, as you're figuring out the sleep issue that you have with your child, and you are skilled, you do have a background in some of these tips and tricks to how to handle, let's say, issues in a family home. So on one hand, you have this knowledge, but on the other hand, you're a mom that's sort of parenting. You're recognizing, I don't know everything that I go into school for. I don't really know if I know that here as a mom. And as a mom, I don't know everything. Maybe I need to lean somewhere else to figure out. So is that what you mean by blind spots? Like, what do you mean when you say you and your husband are recognizing you have blind spots? And does that come up for you at work?
Yeah. So I think like the blind spots can happen because I like legitimately don't know, or like lacking confidence because like this is the first time I've parented a toddler.
Yeah.
A lot of my other experiences being a caregiver in like live-in treatment kind of settings were for adolescents.
Yeah.
Or like younger children, but not toddlers.
Right.
I think it's one thing about like maybe not knowing. It's another thing that sometimes for a variety of reasons, information that you do know, you're not able to access.
Yeah.
So like when I've had someone screaming about the lack of granola bars in the house for, for an extended period of time, I'm not going to be able to be like, what I think is happening is blah, blah, blah. Or late at night, you can't access that info. I think the same thing can happen at work, right? Like there's information that I know that sometimes I'm like, after that session, because after every session, I always, part of like my debrief process is thinking about like, what could I have done differently?
Yeah.
And I always have an answer about like, that didn't really like hit for that client, or I should have done something else, or wouldn't it have been cool if I would have thought of that thing that I did 5 years ago with that other person who, I think part of it is like that self-reflection piece, but the blind spots are always present for us as humans.
I was curious about that because that's sort of what I took from what you were saying, but I wanted to just be clear about, is that what you meant? Because I think that's a nice way of putting it, is many of us drive, we share that. And there are a lot of these blind spots that we can not recognize when we're in the car. And even though we're equipped with safety, like the rear view mirror and or whatever side, all the mirrors, I don't know what they're all called, I'm sorry, but they're all there, and shoulder check, and all these things. And now extra safety precautions in the new vehicles. You have all these things to help prevent a blind spot, but the best prevention is the learning about the fact that there could be a blind spot. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like if I get in my car and I have all these safety features for I don't really know what I'm using it for. But I know when I get in that, okay, they are all going to help me look around and make sure I'm doing my part of being safe on the road. So I sometimes won't see that car over there. And I think it's knowing that there is a chance that I will not always see the car over there. And what am I doing to pay attention to that? I think like talking about blind spots is kind of interesting that came up, because it's sort of where we're headed. And me inviting you on today after you and I had a little funny conversation. And also, side note, you were participating so, like willingly in that stories that I had on Instagram about my haircuts. Actually, let me go back to that, for a second, because that's my error. So I put out a story on Instagram, and I have this thing going on with my fascination with my hair, and like where this is coming from, and it's connected to my roots. And so I've been realizing I've had all these interesting hairstyles all my life. And so for Throwback Thursday, I posted one with my hair and asked people, this was to channel a Hollywood actor. And so people send in their guesses, and you sent in like 1,000, and we were having a funny back and forth of me being like, no, good guess, but no, it's not so-and-so. It's not so-and-so. So you're right. I never told you who it was. Do you want one more guess, or?
It's not Posh Spice, is it?
No, other good guess. No, it was Halle Berry.
Oh, see? And Isn't it interesting? That's my blind spot. I think I only sent you white actresses.
I am really glad you brought that up, because all of the white people that sent in their guesses, maybe there was one white person that got it, but no one guessed a person of color, like celebrity. Yeah. It was all the white actresses that had that haircut. And then only the people of color that message right off the bat were Halle Berry. Like that was the first thing. They're like, Halle Berry. Like all of them got it on the first try. And I did notice that too. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting about how, blind spots, when we were talking about them, how that's so funny. This is going to be a theme, I think, just to recognize that. But the fact that, you even today are like, oh, interesting, that where does that come from, recognizing that? Because not very many people would have picked up on that. But why did you pick up on that?
Well, I think part of it is like, I know what we want to talk about today. So it's like top of mind. If you had asked me 4 days ago.
Yeah.
Like, hey, did you notice a theme? I'm not confident I would have got there.
That's fair. Yeah.
Because I would still be in the blind spot. And so I think that is the message there for me personally, and hopefully for like other people listening, to kind of self-reflect and think about the blind spot. I gotta check my husband tells me that anyways, but I gotta check my blind spot more often.
Yeah. And I think we all do. And I appreciate you saying that in particular about that. So so it was Halle Berry, but yeah, okay, so back on track now. So part of what I wanted to maybe introduce here with you and I is so where this conversation is coming from is that whole stories thing that I just shared. And then, it was like, we spent a lot of time messaging each other over the week. So I was like, do you think that it's time for Angie and Kieran to get together for a recording? And you were like, yeah. And you shared what was on your mind, and you sent me a really interesting TikTok video that there's like an example of a lot of these that have been surfacing about what does being culturally informed as a mental health professional, someone in the human services field, like a therapist, what does that mean? And the ways that we can be blind by people of color that might show up to therapy, especially if you're a white therapist. That was sort of this one TikTok video, but there's lots of these kinds of ideas out there, and they all come down to the cancel culture of, cutting ties. And so you've been noticing something similar in therapy with clients as well, that are adults cutting tie with their adult parents. It's like, oh, this is interesting, because this is, you have a perspective and I'm going to have a perspective in sort of sharing this. And so is there anything you want to add to that in terms of like this conversation?
Well, I think the other piece too is I've also been working with parents who have had some kind of family estrangement and working with them through the distress of that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I'm on both sides.
Yeah. Okay. And so today I'm hopeful that I can bring in a perspective and represent people of color. And while I'm doing that, I want to be clear, like I'm really bringing in my own experiences of child of immigrant parents as a South Asian. So I don't want to assume that all South Asians are in this place. I don't want to assume all BIPOC are in this place. However, I've been doing a lot of thinking and talking with people from my community, people that are of color, because I was saying to you, as you and I were preparing for this, like I've been asking a lot of people of color why they're not going to therapy. And kind of where I started with some of these recordings in the beginning, and my own belief of we all need therapy, we all need this. And so lately I'm like, why are some of my loved ones that could benefit from it even, why are they not going? So I asked some loved ones, some friends and some family members, all people of color, why do you not go to therapy? And the answer from all of them have been either I have gone once, but the therapist that I had wasn't of color, and I'll never go back because I didn't feel understood or heard. I wasn't where they were trying to take me. They told me that my family's toxic. What the heck? My family's my lifeline. So, they're like, I can't go back to therapy because that means I'd have to change my identity. So there's been lots of those responses. And then there's lots of people of color that are like, well, I do go to therapy, but I will only go to a person of color as my therapist because they understand some of the cultural identity, some of the social norms that we talk about here in terms of settler colonization and the impact on many people. So I kind of had that in mind. And you and I, end of the day, it's about these cutting ties or these messages, these very extreme messages that people have been getting about how to respond to family dynamics or cultural identity. And so the question today really is, how can therapists navigate these cultural differences effectively to ensure the therapy remains inclusive and respectful of the diverse experience of their clients? But before I think we can get into that, I'm hoping you and I can kind of start at the beginning, and I want to address, like, do you in some of your community in as therapists, particularly the white therapists, like, are there conversations about, am I the best therapist for a person of color? So some of these people of color that are feeling like I can't go to this therapist because they're not going to get where I'm coming from. Is that something that comes up for you and on your end? And are those conversations that you guys have?
It definitely depends on the therapist. I have some colleagues who I don't know that would engage in that conversation. And I think it's definitely fair for a prospective client to take the position of, I don't feel safe. I want to work with someone who has a better understanding of my background, my experience, or I don't know if all your listeners know, but I am a white, cisgender, middle-class woman whose family has lived in Canada for 200 plus years, like a really long time.
Yeah.
So I think in order to be able to do that effectively, like, you have to be able to self-reflect and take feedback well.
Yeah. And so I guess in some ways today, like, we're going to kind of address these gaps that we find. And some of these gaps are coming from a place of, okay, for people of color, how do we address these? Is there a way to do it? And today we're not going to come to a conclusion. We know that this is a big conversation. This is how you and I are going to operate, but others, may not be there, and hopefully they can join us though. But also, like, at the same time, whether you're white or a person of color, when you show up at therapy or you show up in these mental health facilities where you're having these conversations, and like, how can we be prepared to address, should a mental health professional be saying, cut ties, or right, like, that person's toxic for you, or you're living a toxic life or whatever, like, where's the line with that? So there's like kind of like two themes we're addressing today. So, but to me, both intersect, I guess. Both are about, again, recognizing blind spots and knowing. And for me, as having listeners who maybe are reluctant to go to therapy, or they feel like they're part of a marginalized community and they can't, my hope is by the end of this, there will be, a shift in, okay, there can be safe therapists out there, and here's how I can find the best one for me. And I can have a voice and ask for this.
And I think there is potential for some of that to be healing.
Yeah.
But would it be healing for you to have, like, a white therapist take responsibility for a microaggression, or for, like, missing the mark, or, like, not considering the historical, political, cultural factors of your life, for them to say, like, wow, I missed that, and I'm sorry. Like, what would you think is the best course of action?
You're asking me this? Yeah.
If you want to answer it.
Well, okay, like, first of all, not to digress or to, like, deflect, but the fact that you asked me that, I think, is the answer to my question. So often, from my experience and folks that I've talked to, it's that the client should be the expert. And you know that. You're taught that in therapy school. It doesn't matter who your client is. When they show up in the seat, they are the expert. Even though they don't know anything about what they're saying, they don't know anything about, they're still because they know all the history, they know all their stuff, right? And I think sometimes that gets missed in whether it's in the health system, in general, systemic issues, we can like go there as well. But I'm talking about therapy right now. So when I don't get asked that question, that's part of what's creating the gap. I think right there is a start to filling it with you asking me like, hey, what is your thought on this? Because you're going to know this better than me assuming. And so to me, matters not my answer, but matters the fact that I got asked that. And often a lot of people of color won't know how to answer that because you're not often asked that. You're not often included. If you're part of a marginalized community, you're not often included in some of these conversations of, it's assuming that you're dealing with, let's say, abuse in your home, but you come from parents that are survivors and, fled unsafe countries, all their rationale for why they are survivors, and they're parenting in that mentality. And so, there's a fine line of what abuse is. And I understand that. I grew up here, but a lot of where, let's say, that abuse is coming from or how we want to look at it, we don't talk there about that. We don't go there. And so we start at, well, you should not, as an adult, you should stop talking to your mom, or you should stop talking to your grandma that's in your home, or whoever. And I don't know, like, what are your thoughts about that when as a therapist, if clients are coming to you presenting some of these things, like how would you manage some of these conversations?
I think when someone comes to me and is contemplating that decision, I think of it as like, that's a huge decision. Yeah. To cut somebody out of your life is like, it's big, it's heavy, and it's going to be painful probably and have its own grief process. Like, it's not just you were wronged, cut them out, and then let's move on. I think a really simplistic way to look at it. And of course, like, you should, like, I want that for everyone to be in these supportive relationships that are free from abuse. And it's a complicated thing to navigate when that's not what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Like, I even remember when you and I used to work together at a mental health facility, we'd have young clients that were there. They were essentially apprehended from their home because they were at high risk of abuse and neglect and abandonment and all the terrible things that make up abuse. And yet, some of these clients would find every way to keep running back home. And sometimes they live far away, and some of them found their way, but we had to learn how to not be baffled by why would someone want to maintain a connection or relationship with someone that is hurtful to them? How do you come to that conclusion?
Sorry, I just had like a thought.
Yeah.
Come in. And I also think like that approach is pretty paternalistic. For a therapist to say, now you need to do this, and I'm going to step in and decide this like for you or with you. But, that doesn't really teach someone the skills of how to carefully consider the decision, how to communicate the decision or to practice boundaries, but while maintaining a relationship. I think that's where I've arrived at like a number of relationships in my life where it's like, yeah, I haven't cut anybody off, but like the way that I interact or the way that they participate in my life looks different.
Yeah. A way that an example that makes sense to me is I've talked to some people from the South Asian community that are recovering addicts, and addiction is a big issue in our community. And we also celebrate a lot in our community and have very important cultural events that we go to. And when there are celebrations like a wedding or event, or you go to someone's house, alcohol is such a big part of welcoming people. And sometimes, I've talked to some of the folks that I've interviewed, they've said, like, we feel we have to be at that wedding or that party, but we can still celebrate from afar if that helps us manage the addiction. Right. And so to me, like that, right, there's an example of I'm still part of my community. I still love my community. I understand why this celebration is important, but here's how I have to belong to that now. I have to be different because I have to take care of such a big part of my, like, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of how I hear you talk about it's not black and white when we're cutting ties, like we don't have to sacrifice one thing in order to gain another thing. Is there a way to balance? Can I still have a relationship with that family member? Do you want to add to what I was saying?
I think that's the limiting piece about social media. And, because I have like a therapy practice, I'm trying to create content, right? Like trying to create this content, and you only have 90 seconds. So trying to give somebody information about boundaries or toxic family members or whatever you want to say in 90 seconds, you're going to miss a lot. And I think that's how we're used to receiving information, is these like little digestible mini chunks. And so we believe everyone is a narcissist, everyone is toxic, and now we have to do something about it. And I don't think that approach is helpful. That's why I advocate where if you're at a place where you're contemplating those kind of big life decisions, working it out in therapy is important. At the same time, I hear you when you say how nuanced that is for the BIPOC community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's, on one hand, I don't know if you see this with some of your clients, but you're right. There's so much information out there, and there's like thousands and thousands of these 90-second videos that have a lot of valuable, important information that many of us can connect to. And so let's say you like a video and you think it's good, you send it to me. I look at it and I think, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to work on boundaries. That's what I'm going to do now. I need this in my life. And so what are some tips or tricks that maybe you can suggest to those of us that are grappling and grabbing at various different 90-second videos to try to make sense of some of the things going on in our world, but maybe you're walking with a different message, guilt and shame of, I don't have these kind of boundaries, or there's no way that I could cut my mom off, but I should cut her off because this video is telling me she's toxic. Yeah. But now I can't do that. Now I have no other way of dealing with it. I think so. Is there anything you'd suggest about that?
I think digesting it and just taking it in as information. It's not fact. Like that creator, even though there are like many creators who are fantastic, amazing, expand like my thinking, have this massive following, it doesn't mean it's true for you. Mm-hmm. There is benefit to getting an outside, because you don't know what that therapist or that person would think about your particular nuanced situation. Mm-hmm. Because they're all different. Like there are some people, like I did a lot of work with sibling reunification following sexual abuse. And there is a time and a place to say absolutely no contact until these variety of conditions are met, and it's due to safety. Mm-hmm. And that is different. Like, so what I would advise is different in different situations, and it's impossible for someone to capture your particular situation in 90 seconds.
Yeah. And I think that's just it, right? Like, we're not talking about those extreme situations where this is life or death, and this person is going to deteriorate if we don't take them out of the situation. Like, my hope is that we understand that. So I agree with you. There's a difference in that. And that example is a good example of, there's guidelines. There's still a way to reunify the family or this person if possible, but sometimes that's not the case. I agree. And I think we treat these videos and this knowledge that's coming out at us in a way that often encourages us to think this is the only way. And we also, with our unconscious bias, a lot of times we look for what we want to look for as well. So I'm only going to look for the videos that are going to apply to, my belief. If I think the sky is always blue, then I'm only going to look for videos that are going to support that the sky is always blue, and even at night it's still blue. And so
and the algorithm will help you with that.
Oh, exactly. It's like if you look at my Instagram feed, it's like I get targeted ads for other therapists and pit bull puppies. And it may be like ideas about like toddler sleep. Yeah, like what to do at 3 a.m. if your toddler's not sleeping. All these infomercials that they're like, please buy this now. Yeah, exactly, right? So when we're looking for that, and sometimes I think I worry about that too, in that this information that's coming at us, coming from my background, a lot of times what we or I will see on TikTok and social media is the Western way of looking at it. So the Western way is cut these ties and this person's toxic, and so now I have to cut them. Or the Western society is telling me that this is what abuse means. This is what toxic means. this is what being culturally informed means. And what I think where the gap is, there isn't enough out there of people of color talking about what being culturally informed means. And there's so many of us that can benefit from therapy, but there's so many people of color that aren't in the human services field that could help offer or help bridge some of those gaps. Because again, we see these things on TikTok and then we think, oh shit, I feel this way, but now I don't know how to go and find a therapist that can maybe help me work through it because my friend told me don't ever go to a therapist. They all tell you, you know, that you growing up Indian is like doesn't make sense. So not to say that that's what all the therapists do, but that's often, you know, as I've been talking to a lot of people, like I said, that's how people are translating and that's how it's coming back to folks is that therapy is not meant for you if you are not white, if you're not bred in that Western world. And I'm hopeful that that's not where we're going to conclude. Like, I'm hopeful that we can come to a place where there is education and there is, you know, blind spot catching so that more people can receive the support that they probably could benefit from.
Yeah. And I think there is a movement in that direction. Obviously, still a lot of work to go. But if you are looking for a therapist, I think most therapists should offer, like if you're in private practice, it's a little bit different in community settings, perhaps. But in private practice, therapists usually offer a free 15 to 20 minute consultation. And I think it's fair to bring those concerns forward and say, like, this is what I'm worried about. How would you respond to that? And how would you help create a safe space? And can I talk to you about if I feel like you're missing the mark culturally, or if there's some kind of unintended or maybe intended, I don't know, depending on the experience, but microaggression or actual aggression or something like that. Like, can you navigate that with me? Mm-hmm. And you will get a feel for if that person is able to walk that road and kind of be on their own journey of learning and being able to, because therapy is all about asking great questions.
Yeah.
And so are they committed to that learning process to ask the really great questions that's going to help you think and like expand what you think?
I think that's helpful to hear. And I wonder how many folks would say that they feel confident or comfortable to ask that question or to go to the consult and say, hey, how culturally informed are you? You know, and again, I think therapists all mean well. And I think just like a human, you're not going to always know your blind spots and be able to say, oh yeah, you know, I don't know. You did something really good, which was you asked me the question. How would you know? You know, like, so it's like I would love for a therapist to say, how would you know, Kieran, that you as a person of color are feeling supported and empowered and feel like I understand your history, you know, like those, then that helps me sort of think about what do I need to look for? How would I know and maybe we can talk about that a little bit. What would a good white therapist with a person of color relationship look like so that folks can maybe look for that? Because again, the hope is that people want to attend therapy and there's long wait lists for people of color therapists. So, because there's not so many out there. So, is it possible to do work as a person of color with someone that isn't? And I don't know. For me, it's been times where it's been helpful. I've had a white therapist and it's really been great. And there's been times where I'm like, okay, this didn't work at all. I can't have this conversation. But I also won't say anything about it because I have a lot of fear of saying something. So I think people share that. So today's like helping me as well, who am incredibly uncomfortable. My armpits are sweating. I don't want to offend you. I know you don't want to offend me. I don't want to offend people listening, but all that can't matter because I think we still have to get to the bottom of what we want to, which is we want more people from marginalized communities to feel like they can go to therapy. Right. So like, that's why it's like, we ought to have some of these conversations. So like, even for me, this is hard to like say, what should I ask when I show up as a South Asian woman? And let's say you're there before me. How can I ask the question so that I feel you and I can work through Western and Eastern norms?
Part of why this conversation is able to take place, sorry, I'm not intending to dodge the question.
Yeah.
Just like a quick comment.
Yeah.
Is like, I think our relationship is is strong enough to be able to tolerate different opinion.
Yeah.
And I have this respect for you where I think that you have a lot of value to help me expand how I think about things. And before we started, I did apologize because it is unfortunate that part of this conversation is you having to educate me, which is, I don't think is your responsibility. And so I think the place to start is acknowledging that and my commitment to knowing I don't know and taking responsibility to try to find out. And I think in me trying to find out, I have had to like lean on people from different cultures to guide me so that I can ask those good questions. I'm so incredibly grateful to those people because the blind spots are blind until you shed light on them.
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm like, okay, she's talking. I can bawl my eyes out right now. And now I'm back. Look, I think this is it right here. I think, like, let's just be real for a second. First of all, thank you for that. I told you right before we started this, I've been skirting around just prepping literally to the second we were going to start talking today. And now I sit here and I think that was my blind spot that I didn't pick up on was I'm showing up to a conversation with this pressure of I have to educate you about something that you just like it's so important that you just did what you did because I can feel it. So I know it's important is that you took responsibility out of my hands for something that's not my responsibility. And right. I think that happens so rarely. And so that right there is a start of so many other conversations, whether it's a, person of color, friends with someone that is not, whether it's you're in a therapist relationship, whether you're just going to someone's house to help something, whatever. I think the fact that you recognize that the racism is always happening and that, when you talk, the way you talk to me tells me, like you're saying, we have to roll our eyes to the fact that when we say there's no racism in therapy, is that you're saying, oh yeah, that's not my intention, but I know I don't have the same experience as you. But it's my job to educate myself and be responsible in learning about what are my blind spots and what are the ways that I can help my client. And, you said it way better than I'm recapping it, but to hear that was so validating because it's like I'm trying to ask questions in a way that are leading you to answer in a certain way. And I shouldn't be doing that because it felt so weird to be like, I got to ask Angie these things. But at the same time, these aren't the things that I need to be asking her. But what you said was actually what needed to be said without even realizing it was, how can you do that? Like, that's not your role in this. And it's like, okay, if you take that off my hands, then I can focus on what my role is, which is figuring out how to make sense of living in this world and how to navigate some things that, overlap between Eastern and Western. And that's what it is. And we can't fully change the way the system is running, operating above us. But when you interact with me in the way you do, you're being part of breaking some of that, like you are contributing to saying, we have a problem here and we have to keep addressing this.
And it's part of the healing, right? Because if I just did, and like this isn't therapy, but if we imagined if it was, and I was just like asking you CBT based questions, which has its time and place, but it's not getting at the oppression that happens with racism. And I think there can be healing in that dynamic, but also like, I think it's fair and valid for people to say like, I don't want to go to a white therapist. Like I would not be offended. I would be like, I can appreciate that given my limited lived experience, but I have empathy and take responsibility for my own education, knowing that I miss stuff all the time.
Yeah. I feel like this is turning into good healing for just even two friends that are of two different races to have a conversation like this. It's so scary to have because there's always this worry that I'm going to lose more people in my life that have been part of my life because I'm honoring my people. And there's guilt and shame in honoring them, because then it starts to feel like I'm meeting aggression with aggression, as we talked about, right? Which isn't helpful too. But on many levels, it's, when I talk to family or talk to friends of, similar backgrounds, it's like hard to figure out what do we do and how do we continue these kind of relationships, interracial friendships, while knowing that there's so much that we won't understand of each other, and instead of forcing that or acting like we do, can we start to have, real conversations about, like you're saying, I don't know all of that, and I can still validate you and I can still be empathetic, like you said, while being responsible and figuring out my role. And I think these one-on-ones or group setting kind of conversations can be such a big part of that process of healing.
Yeah. And I think in order for, like, you have to have the specific ingredients. I don't want to always use like a big word like context. It makes me sound smarter than I am. But you have to have the right ingredients for that conversation to take place. So in our situation, like, we are both well-resourced. So we have the ability to tolerate uncomfortable feelings and the ability to accept responsibility, where I'm like, yeah, like, might say something here that's out of pocket, and I'll feel badly that Kieran has to kind of check me and be like, no, like, you're missing this whole other thing. And I would say, oh my gosh, like, thank you for helping me.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry you're in that position. And I value the time that you took, knowing the expense it could have. That's why this conversation is able to take place, because we, I think, both come to the conversation with skill and with valuing the relationship.
Yeah. If we can meet each other gracefully, maybe some of that anger can, turn into, okay, we are two forces trying to join together and work through some of, our past, because it's not just our past, it's your past too, like you said, right? As an example, I've been here for over 200 years. So, okay, that's fantastic. Now let's recognize that and work through that. And you're going to bring conversations to, this context or this topic. And as I am, and this conversation is contributing to the bigger picture. And sometimes we just want to jump to the macro, and it's not going to happen overnight. Clearly, a lot of advocates, a lot of people have dedicated their life, know this. It's not going to happen overnight, as, we've seen. So can we be small part of the big change, where in these day-to-day interactions, we're like, okay, we had these kinds of conversations that help us contribute to the change. So yeah, sure, be direct, be blunt, middle fingers up to all this stuff. We can say this, and this, but like you said, there's value in this conversation.
I appreciate your vulnerability in this space, because I think, guessing that there's lots of people who want to have these kind of conversations, and you're kind of at the risk of bringing up like a Beyonce reference. I know it's risky to do with you, but you're kind of like in this, like, what would I call, like, a cultural renaissance?
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, where you're like,
that's the new, let's coin that one.
Yeah, cultural renaissance. And I think that's really beautiful. And when you're authentically in relationships with people and there's something that you're interested in, I think, it's important to support the people that you love and are in friendship with, or your family. And when that's not happening, I think trying your best to be calm so that your valid points are being heard. Mm-hmm. Because I think sometimes, definitely, I do a lot of family therapy, and sometimes that intensity, people just focus on that. And that doesn't mean that people don't have a right to feel those emotions: outrage, disgust, distress, betrayal, like all of those things that I imagine could come up with navigating like these waters. But I think it's about, like, can you be strategic so your message gets heard? And it's unfortunate that that's part of being heard.
We're encouraged to bring it up or say something, but then on the other hand, a lot of the world's not ready. They're not there. They're not recognizing. There's the blind spots, blinders on to recognize, where some of these things are coming from. And so my question maybe to you at this point would be, what is a way that we can bring this up? What is a way that we can be having more of these conversations?
Well, I think like for me, and I was pretty lucky to have like some pretty fantastic teachers, and I think for like pretty good training experiences and my growth as a therapist. And one of my teachers would say that it's important to ask for feedback. So I try in most of my sessions at the end saying something like, what stood out for you? What will you be thinking about between now and the next session? And the last one is probably, I think, the most important one is, was there anything that we talked about today that you would like to see different for next time, or something that you need me to change? Mm-hmm. And part of that is like, I consider myself to be pretty adaptable, and I do have like a pretty specific style that is laid back, joking, and that doesn't land with everyone. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. And if they need something different from me, like, I can change it up, but I need to know. Mm-hmm. And so I invite that. And usually oh, no, everything was great. Don't worry. And I'm like, well, okay. And then I'll ask it again and mm-hmm. ask it again to create that space that it's okay for you to disagree with me.
Yeah.
It's okay to say, I think you missed a big piece here. In my cultural context, like, we don't cut off family. Mm-hmm. And then I would say, thank you for letting me know. I'm going to look into it further. If you have something you'd like me to read or recommend, happy to hear it. If not, I'm not going to put that burden on you.
Totally, right? It's like a funny story with that cutting family off. Like, I even remember years ago, I had a friend, I still have this friend actually, and they were also in the same field. And so I complain about some relationship issues with family members, and over and over and over, I guess I'm, talking about, oh, this is going on. And my friend's response always was, yeah. And now that I think about it, was cutting ties off, was like, you have a choice. Like, why do you keep going back and having that kind of a relationship? You have a choice. You're choosing to now be in a toxic relationship with this family member. And I just always remember feeling so bad about that, because I'm like, oh my God, this is my choice. It's my choice. I have to do something about it. I have to like stop this. And, like one day, I don't know, thankfully I realized, and it was like, fuck that shit. Like, this person's such an important part of my life, and I'm not going to not have a relationship with them. Like, that's just not possible. You can't tell me that. But over time, in talking to others and growing a bit, I think, okay, I realize how to have that relationship with this family member and still have them in my life. And I think that is what we're hoping for, is it have to be one extreme or the other? And that can be whether it's cutting ties with a family member, cutting ties with a friend, or deciding you're going to vote for the complete opposite political party. Am I vaccinated or not? Like, we're just bred on all these extremes always. You have to do it this way or this way.
Like, when we were preparing for this conversation, I was thinking a lot about those dynamics. And that's when the relationship loses, when you get stuck in extremes. And having boundaries is not trying to control someone and make them be part of your point of view. Having boundaries is saying, hey, this is not safe for me. This is not fit for me. But, when you have boundaries with someone, they don't get to decide about like who you marry, what you choose to do. Maybe they'll have input out of care and concern for you, but you can say like, thanks very much, and kind of consider that information elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, funny fact is a lot of our parents do decide who we marry.
Oh, yeah. Right. Blind spot.
Yeah, right? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, not all of us, and a lot of old generations, there's lots of marriages where it wasn't arranged, but it is such a big part of our community. And it's also interesting because I've been started this series this year. We're doing a 3-part series where I interview newlywed Indian couple. And cool. Yeah, so I'm following them this year because a lot of in our community, I'm trying to figure out like, where's the disconnect from this wanting to get married, this big wedding, and very soon after, there's lots of marital issues and all sorts of things. And a lot of it I see is the Eastern and Western combination. Like, for example, many of us don't move out of the house before we get married. We move out at our wedding, essentially. But the Western pressure is you're not set up. You have to move out. You have to live together. Your relationship can't be successful if you're not living together beforehand.
Right.
And, either or work for people. It's again, finding the middle ground as an Eastern Westerner of, okay, this is how our community believes a relationship should be. No moving in before marriage, no playing house until you actually get married. Marriage is important. Is that the case for me? That's what I had to figure out, when I decided to go and make things complicated and date a white guy at the age of 20, and then move out with him 3 months later, and then move to Calgary like less than 2 years later. So it's like I did things a bit different, but there was a lot of process with my parents, and so it was the balance of, okay, it's this is what works for me. But also, how do I help my family, meet me where I'm at, and how do I meet them where they're at? And we may disagree, but can we work through that? And some families you can't. Some families, this is what my situation was, is just not possible. There's other possibilities, but I had to kind of, find that balance in some things, maybe not all the things.
Just like a comment on the older generation, because I have been doing some work with grandparent generation is like, this stuff is not natural to them.
Yeah.
And they're not probably not seeing the same social media stuff that you are.
Yeah.
And there is a way that you can caringly explain and trying to come at it from like a place of understanding. And to like the older generation, I think is really important to like listen and hear what's not being said, but also getting clear about deciding to not come to family events or deciding non-contact, whatever that looks like. Understanding the why and then taking responsibility about what you could do different is going to be the ingredients to coming back together.
I have a story about that. I have a friend who is the generation, kind of like just the generation before me. And she came here young, got married young, and isn't that much older than me. But, her and I were talking about the generations, because her daughter is a little bit older, in her 20s, but is kind of growing up in the Western, was born here, growing up here. This friend of mine wasn't born here, and her parents, so the grandparents are here. So these 3 generations. And what's really interesting about that is my friend, her and her own mom have been, the 2 generations of immigrants that came here are having very interesting conversations as they're preparing for, they're going to age, they're going to die at some point. And there's really, we don't really know when, but we're getting close to that. And it's been interesting hearing about, oh my gosh, these heart-to-hearts about sacrificing and surviving and thriving and the differences in between of, because one generation only knew how to do it this way, my friend feels a pressure in her generation. You have to carry some of those sacrifices along, which is happiness isn't, necessarily take care of your family comes first. And you put everyone else first. And this friend is struggling with that because she's getting older too. And there's things in life, because she spent quite a bit of time out here, there's things in life that she wants to be able to do. And I tell her all the time, I'm like, you guys, you got to come on this. We got to talk about this, because you're doing something that a lot of people from the Eastern world aren't. But I think we want to. We cremate our grandparents, we cremate our parents, and we have a lot of guilt because we didn't have the kind of conversations we really wish we could have. But we didn't know how to, because for some of us, you don't have those kind of talks. And to have this friend try to break that cycle, because she wants to be able to also build that with her own daughter, who's going to be entering her 30s and maybe getting married and having kids. And so to me, when I see the growth and the ability for change in that, I think, okay, that to me is an example of how we can bridge these gaps. What society expects of us, whether we're Eastern, Western, living in the both world, whether we're trying to grow from, how we were raised or what, but there are ways that we can do it. And I'm watching her do this with her mom, and it's like, strengthening this really bond and this relationship that this friend of mine is going to get so much out of.
Yeah. And I would say that they probably have the skill to tolerate differences, to tolerate like different opinion, to be curious. Like that's like an element that you and I always come back to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's value in doing your own work, and not every family member or friendship is going to be engaged in that. And you'll have to like make some careful decisions from there. It's worth it. It sucks to feel uncomfortable and to see someone you care about in pain, and to know maybe that you've caused that or have responsibility in that. But what comes out, it's a rainbow, I guess.
Yeah, right? We all like rainbows.
My question to you is, what advice would you have for someone who is not from the Western culture, or from maybe the BIPOC community, or what would you advise them to do if they were nervous about going to therapy?
I'm glad you asked, because I have a list of things. I didn't know how to bring it up, but thank you for asking me.
Oh,
this is great.
It wasn't planned either.
Because I'm like, I'm the host. How do I ask you to ask me this? But thank you for just knowing to ask. So it's not just what, I think it's for what those that work in human resources, so mental health, therapy, and all of that in between. This is what I think for both sides, what someone like you can do and what someone like me can do. I would break it down to this. So I would say, first, let's start with, what is cultural humility? And cultural humility to me is like being humble and understanding that I have this thing called an ego, and sometimes it gets in the way and I don't know everything. And so to me, the best education is addressing that ego, being aware of it. When does it show up? Does it show up when my friends of color try to tell me certain things that I don't know about and I feel defensive or really bad? So then I have to say things like, I did a diversity course, or, you know, like where does it come up? I think hiring more people of color at practices, whether it's in the health system, places in human resources, you know, like I was saying to you, sometimes you don't have any people of color and you hear, well, it's really hard to find someone. And you know, you're hiring someone for a job that you may not actually know what it is, because a person of color's job is going to be different as a therapist than not. So looking at our businesses and are we actually giving the same kind of time when we're looking at a resume of someone of color than someone that's not? Do we hire white people quicker than people because we're like, oh, I don't know if they're the right fit for us? So looking at things like that. So that's part of cultural humility. So looking at understanding the impact of systemic racism, discrimination, intergenerational trauma. Can all of these be playing a part in, and is my client bringing some of this, maybe not even recognizing some of this when they're sitting before me and they're about to engage in a therapy session? Empowerment. You know, you did that today. Like this is like asking me for my voice, caring about my voice. It's not just about, well, like I encouraged her and she didn't speak up. I'm learning now more why people don't speak up. And it's not that they weren't invited. They're invited a lot of times to speak up. It's because they don't feel valued and don't feel like up until now they've really been able to practice speaking up and saying something. So I think it's also recognizing that. Addressing our biases. So, you know, you talked about self-reflection. And so what privileges am I bringing to the table? Look, I'm a child of immigrant parents, and I know I have a lot more privilege that I was born with, even though I'm a person of color, than my parents will ever have, than my grandparents ever had. And I understand that, and that gets in the way sometimes. And I have to be reminded that too by, you know, family as well. So these are things that I have to recognize. I think we all have to pay attention to that. And then creating safe spaces. You talked about this too. And I think part of that is creating a safe space is we talk a lot about education and training, and we say, I did this diversity management course, it's on my resume, or I went to this seminar, I went to this workshop, but who's running them? Are people of color running them? You know?
And they're from a really Western perspective too. Like That is such a white person thing to do.
Yeah.
To say, come to my training with my PowerPoint.
Yeah. You know, like
Yeah.
exactly. So who's running these? And so I think we sometimes trick ourselves with thinking, oh, I learned one thing, so that means I'm growing, and that's good. You learned that thing, but there's don't stop there. That one training exactly didn't give you what maybe talking to someone of color and learning about their experiences, reading books written by people of color, watching movies made by them, because that's a different angle that only that person of color could understand how to do. So I think those are ways that we can actually educate instead of rolling our eyes when someone says something or, whatnot. So I think, one last thing I'm going to suggest, because it's your podcast episode today and I'm your guest on, so I can talk more today.
Yeah. And that's how it should be. That's how it should be for this topic.
Well, I don't know, but I'm going to do it now because I have a story, okay?
Okay.
And I want to share it. And this person said I could. This person says to me something they want to address in childcare is when parents come in to meet the person that is running this childcare and they say things like, we're so glad you can speak clear English. And, after we've toured all of these preschools and daycares, English is not the first language of many of these caregivers. So we're really glad your English is clear. And so this person is like, look, I'm learning how to speak up, but here's what I've been saying lately. And there is so much your child can benefit from if their childcare provider, their teacher, another person that can be part of the collective is of color, because they're being educated in a way that won't be so painful when they're 50 years old and attend diversity training. They're learning that there are other languages, different accents, different ways to speak. And, just because you can speak clear English doesn't mean you're successful. When they said this to me, I thought, yeah, can a person of color be a therapist to a white person? Can that happen? That's something to think about. Why not? Why can't it? So why can't your childcare provider not speak the best English? Like, what's wrong with that, right? So I think it's also flipping that way too. So those would be the things that I was thinking about that I wouldn't have brought up if you didn't ask, just so you know.
Okay, well.
So thank you for asking. I got work to do too.
Yeah, well, and I think just to add on to that comment, because I'm as I talk about every time with my toddler, he is in a childcare situation. So I have toured lots of facilities. Yeah. And I think the commonality is our society doesn't value childcare. And so we have marginalized people doing that work.
Yeah.
And so my challenge to those people is okay, what you said about valuing these other gifts that come to the table. Mm-hmm. And kids are smart and they will pick up. Mm-hmm. They're like little sponges. If you have had a toddler, hear someone say the F word, it's locked in
forever.
Forever. And so I just like that you leveraged that other learning that I think is really crucial.
Yeah. Yeah,
for kids.
For sure. That's the way to look at it is, okay, so this is where we're at. Part of this is the systemic piece of where we've been boxed into here. And now, okay, we're boxed in here. You're going to go get this care provider. And what are you going to say to that? That was what was on my mind. That was what I was hoping that I could speak up and talk about this today. And I started out with a ball in my stomach, and I just, I'm going to give my own pre and post measure here. But I'm leaving here feeling this sense of relief, you and I were able to talk about some hard things that are sometimes on some of our minds, definitely on mine as they're coming out of my mouth. And I feel good walking away knowing that I still have you and I can still come back to you, and that if something that you didn't understand what I was saying, that my hope is you will message me, or you will also come back to me too and say,
of course,
can I learn more about this, or can we get more clear about that? It doesn't have to be about I'm sorry, and hopefully we can get to a place where we don't always have to preface with I love you, you're so great. But that's where I feel I am at. And folks like you help me feel like we can think about the big picture and not just this. It's not just about a you and me relationship. We're contributing to a bigger part of society here. So we owe it to that.
Yeah, that's my hope. And I think it comes back to like that tip, the mulligan, try again, say, oh, sorry, that didn't come. Because sometimes I'm sure there have been clients who have said like, wow, that white person didn't get it. Like, I'm not out here thinking that I hit it out of the park every time, or I'm always like culturally humble or aware. I know part of my blind spot is I have an awareness that I won't get it right all the time. And I think there is power in saying, that like didn't sit right, or coming back to it. Kieran, when I said that thing, like I've reflected, it doesn't like land. Can I try again with you? Yeah. And I'm sorry that you're being part of my learning, and like, thank you for doing that.
Oh my gosh. If that is how we would interact in therapy. I mean, I know in friendship that exists, but in therapy, I think, gosh, like it's always what I've learned about therapists and in the mental health world is it's a constant education. You have to always keep up with it. You have to be learning with everything. And I think this piece is such a big part of that learning. And I hear you. I do. I hear you say that you're striving for that. And when you don't know, you're okay saying, I don't know this. And you're more than okay when someone tells you, you don't know this. So, to me, that's the start.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then taking these conversations like in other places too afterwards about, okay, this was hard, but also helpful in maybe, in the community, right? In your community as well of like, here, maybe we should put together a training that is actually going to help us learn versus, like you said, the good old 1950s diversity in the workplace training or whatever we all ever had to attend at school and at work. And, you're like, this is great, but many of us are immune and don't know how to think outside of that. And someone like me that would be naive and started mental health school years ago would have gone along with that and said, yeah, okay, this is the way it's, this is diverse. Okay, this is good. This is what we're doing. Okay, this is, And I think we're now realizing, okay, we gotta step it up. We gotta do 2.0 now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything for you that you want to add or another question or something before we wrap up?
No, I think, this conversation has been like fruitful for me personally. And I appreciate you having like the trust in me to go to some of these places. And, I'm going to think a lot about and continue to read. I've been doing lots of reading the last couple of years, and I still have a lot more to learn.
I hear you. Me too. Okay. Well, I want to thank you as well for sitting down with what started out as a painful conversation and ended up getting somewhere. And I also want to thank folks listening who also were part of the painful start. Maybe it's just me feeling that way. Maybe some of you are feeling other things, but we won't know how you're feeling if you don't tell us. So these conversations are door openers. Please help us keep this door open. Please send us information and your thoughts and your feedback because we want to keep coming back and talking about this. And Angie and I might have missed something completely, or we might have struggled to touch on something. So help us out with that. Send me some feedback, please. Otherwise, once more, thank you so much for always giving MFU time, Ange.
Of course. Happy to do it.